Masaimara, Land of Legends. This is Masaimara, one of the last great theatres of wildland where ancient traditions meet untamed wilderness. A place where history was not only written by men but also carved by rivers, storms, migrations, and eternal rhythm of life in death. Chapter 1: The Ancient Lands, Prehistoric Era. Long before the Maasai warriors, long before the British explorers, this land was alive with creatures older than history itself. The Masai Mara lies on the eastern edge of Africa's Great Rift Valley, a vast scar across the continent stretching over 6,000 kilometers from Lebanon to Mozambique. Scientists call it cradle for humankind, and for good reason, for here the earliest traces of our ancestors were found. Around 2 million years ago, early humans, Homo habilis and later Homo erectus, walked these plains. They chipped stone tools from volcanic rock. They scavenged meat from fallen prey. They learned to survive in a land filled with predators, lions, saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, and massive elephants unlikely any alive today. Every footprint left in the Mara's red earth was a step forward in the story of mankind, and the Mara was both classroom and the battleground, teaching resilience, cooperation, and will to endure. Imagine the Mara not as well as it today, but it was millions of years ago. Forests gave way to open grasslands. With this change came to great herds behind them and the hunters. These plains was not just to wildlife, but the very instinct that would one day define humankind. When we look at the Masai Mara, we are not just seeing the Africa's wilderness. We are looking at the mirror reflecting the earliest chapters of our own existence. Around 2 million years ago, early humans, Homo habilis and later Homo erectus, walked these plains. They chipped stone tools from volcanic rock. They scavenged meat from fallen prey. They learned to survive in a land filled with predators, lions, saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, and massive elephants unlikely any alive today. Every footprint left in the Mara's red earth was a step forward in the story of mankind, and the Mara was both classroom and the battleground, teaching resilience, cooperation, and will to endure. The Maasai lives in Manitas, family homestead built of mud, sticks, and cow dung. Their lives are structured by age sets. Children grow into warriors, warriors mature into elders, and elders become guardians of the wisdom. Even today, the warrior dance, the Adamu, symbolizes strength and unity. To leap high is not only a show of courage, but a declaration of pride. The very name Mara comes from the Ma language, meaning spotted. From above, the plains looked like a canvas dotted with the acacia trees, bushes, and the shadow of passing clouds. The Maasai gave this land its name and, in doing so, claimed it as eternal home. Life in the Mara was not without struggle. The Maasai faced rival tribes, droughts, and the dangers of wild predators. But through it all, they stood unshaken. Their identity was and still is woven into their cattle, their land, and their God. To lose cattle was to lose life itself. To defend cattle was to defend honor. And so the Maasai became both shepherd and warriors, guardians of the Mara. Imagine the Mara not as well as it today, but it was Millions of years ago, forests gave way to open grasslands. With this change came to great herds behind them and the hunters. These plains falls not just to wildlife, but the very instinct that would one day define humankind. When we look at the Masai Mara, we are not just seeing the Africa's wilderness. We are looking at the mirror reflecting the earliest chapters of our own existence. When the Maasai came to Mara, they did not see the wilderness. They saw a divine inheritance to them. This was not end of the journey, but the beginning of convenience between their god, their cattle, and this sacred land. Colonial shadows. Late 19th, early 20th century. By the late 19th century, the vast plains of the Mara, once ruled only by nature and the Maasai, caught attention of outsiders. For centuries, Africa had been a mystery to Europeans and so-called dark continent. But with the dawn of the age of exploration, no land remained untouched. Explorers, missionaries, and eventually colonial powers set their eyes upon East Africa. The Mara was no longer just land of Maasai, it became a prize in a greater game of empire. When a Scottish explorer, Joseph Thomas, crossed Maasai lands in 1883, he described the people as fierce and the fearless, and the land as an untouched paradise of wildlife. He was one of the first Europeans to write extensively about Mara and calling it a place for both beauty and danger. But exploration soon gave way to something far more permanent: colonization. In 1895, Britain declared the East Africa Protectorate, which would later become Kenya. Lands once grazed by Maasai cattle were steadily claimed by colonial administrators, settlers, and hunters. The Maasai were forced into designated reserves. Their movement restricted, their power diminished. The arrival of the railway changed everything. What once took weeks by caravans, which could be reached in days, the Mara and its wildlife became accessible not just to explorers but to tourists and hunters from across the British Empire. Big game hunting became a mark of prestige. The Mara's lion, elephants, and rhinos were no longer respected as guardians of the land. They became trophies to be mounted on the walls of London mansions. The Maasai watched in silence as their sacred animals were slaughtered in numbers of unimaginable. Their land, their cattle, their gods were being overshadowed by a foreign hunger of conquest and display. But the Maasai were not passive. They resisted, sometimes in battle, sometimes in negotiations, yet the tide But the Maasai were not passive. They resisted, sometimes in battles, sometimes in negotiation, yet the tide of the empire was relentless. By the early 20th century, the Maasai had been moved from their fertile lands in Laikipia and the Rift, continued to southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. The Mara remained there in spirit but under colonial shadow in law. The age of colonial transferred the Mara forever. It was no longer just homeland but a territory on a map, a hunting ground, a commodity. Yet beneath the shadow of empire, the spirit of Maasai and the wild entered, waiting a new chapter to begin. The birth of reserve 1940s to 1960s. By the mid-20th century, the age of colonial conquest was fading, but its legacy remained written on the land. The Mara's animals had been hunted in staggering numbers. Lions were pursued for sports, rhinos for their horns, elephants for ivory. What had once been an endless wilderness now faced the threat of silence. Yet even in these turbulent years, voice rose, voices that would begin with a fight for protection. In 1948, the first step was taken. The Masaimara was declared a wildlife sanctuary. At first, it covered only a small fraction of today's reserve, about 520 kilometers, but it was a beginning, a recognition that the land was worth more alive than dead. The colonial administration set aside Amara as a sanctuary for a big five: lions, elephants, leopards, buffalo, and rhinos. Animals that were once hunted as trophies, now seen as a treasures to protect. But as wildlife found new guardians, Kenya itself was changing. Across the country, the Mau Mau uprising shook colonial rule. The dream of independence grew stronger, and the independence came new questions. Who would own the land, and who would protect it? For the Maasai, this was a moment of uncertainty. Their ancestor grazing grounds were being fenced as a reserve. Some saw protection as a loss of freedom, but others saw it as a chance of survival, not just for the animals, but for their own culture. But the Maasai were not passive. They resisted, sometimes in battles, sometimes in negotiation, yet the tide of the empire was relentless. By the early 20th century, the Maasai had been moved from their fertile lands in Laikipia and the Rift, continued to southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. The Mara remained there in spirit but under colonial shadow in law. The age of colonial transferred the Mara forever. It was no longer just homeland but a territory on a map, a hunting ground, a commodity. Yet beneath the shadow of empire, the spirit of Maasai and the wild entered, waiting a new chapter to begin. The Great Migration, nature's eternal drama. Every year, over 1.5 million wildebeest, zebras, and gazelles cross the Serengeti and Mara in search of fresh pastures. It is the largest land migration on Earth, a cycle of birth, death, and rebirth that has occurred for centuries. The Masai Mara became famous for its migration, and the world began to see it not just as Africa's treasure, but as humanity's shared heritage. But the Mara story has not been without struggle. In 1970s and 80s, poaching decimated elephant and rhino population. Expanding human settlements, climate change, and modern pressures threatened this fragile balance. Yet hope endures. Today, conservationists and Maasai peoples work side by side. Community conservancies allow wildlife to and humans to coexist. Tourism provides income, and the Maasai preserve their tradition even as the modern world encroaches. The Masai Mara is more than a reserve. It is a living tapestry woven with the threads of ancient culture, colonial history, and a timeless nature. A reminder that the earth is not ours to own, but ours to protect. And for as long as Mara lives, the story of humanity and the wild continues.